Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this, our second EDAS Conference session, focusing on climate change in the run-up to COP26. I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting today's session, which is focusing on climate and what this means for people in terms of employment, skills, and business opportunities. This subject is absolutely central to the work EDAS is taking forward as we create spaces for our members to hear from expert speakers leading in this field and provide opportunities for dialogue and learning as we navigate the rapidly expanding climate agenda, which is now so central to the work of economic development practitioners across Scotland. This week's Fairer, Greener Scotland programme for government places climate at the heart of policy and economic transformation and significantly reinforces this direction of travel. So it's vital that we all understand fully how the business, skills and employment landscape is changing and what this means for economic development going forward. There are clearly many opportunities, but also significant challenges to this vital but complex agenda, which is now being taken forward at pace. In addition to creating sessions like this, within EDAS, we're also looking at what this means for our CPD, as in continuing professional development and learning offerings for the future. So we ensure our members are able to successfully navigate this new landscape and deliver day to day on these high-level policy priorities. We're also mindful our members have been facing unique pressures in responding to the pandemic over the last year and a half. So we want to try to support and help in ways that are straightforward and easily accessible. So building on our conference launch in May of this year, I'm delighted to say we have an absolutely fantastic lineup of speakers for our second event this afternoon. And I think the main challenge, to be honest with you, will be about ensuring we have enough time for all that they have to share. Our session will be split into two halves. The first setting the context and providing a macro view of what's happening around the transition to net zero and its implications for people. And to this end, we have two impressive speakers to set the scene. Firstly, Professor Dave Ray from the University of Edinburgh, who will bring both a Scottish and an international perspective to our audience based on his experience and knowledge honed through many years researching and writing about the effects of climate change. We'll then hear from Marissa from Skills Development Scotland, who will look at the skills and employment dimension, drawing on the work undertaken by SDS in publishing the recent Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan, as well as her many years' experience working on environmental issues. We'll have time for questions and comments after this, and you can post questions in the chat box, but I'd also really like to encourage people to speak so we feel things are a little bit more interactive as we still try to navigate these days of not being in the same room. We'll then take a short break before our next two speakers, who will focus on the inclusive dimension and how to ensure all parts of Scotland benefit from net zero, and that this policy is used to address some of the long-standing entrenched issues around low skill levels, poverty and deprivation. To cover this, we're going to hear from Katie Fair, who heads up the Just Transition Policy Unit in the Scottish Government, and who will bring a government perspective on addressing inequalities and fairness. And we'll end with our final speaker, Claire Mack, Chief Executive of Scottish Renewables. And Claire will focus on the business picture, bringing a wealth of experience in the field of renewables as she shares opportunities around business development, supply chain, as well as highlighting some pinch points in the system that need to be addressed if we're to meet the government's aspirations. Now, I'll introduce each speaker in turn, but before we hear from them, we're going to start today's session with a short poll to get a sense of where you, the audience, are regarding this agenda. We're going to ask you a series of questions throughout the afternoon, so please do engage with this. And I'd like to now hand over briefly to my colleague Ewan, who's going to guide us through this first part of the poll. And I think we'll probably start with a test question. I should also say that you've obviously got a QR code. It should be showing on your screen right now, which obviously you can access this through your camera on your smartphones. But if you can't do that, we're also, I think, posting a link through the chat box if it's easier for you to access the poll that way. So can I just hand over to you briefly, Ewan, to get us started?
Thank you very much, Liz, and welcome everybody. So we've just got a little test poll for our live audience polling here for today's session, for which, as Liz said, we're using menti.com. So if you have an iPhone, you can scan the code that you can now see on your screen. If you have a smartphone with Android and with a QR scanner function, you can do the same. And if not, you can, as Liz has said, access the link directly in the chat to access the poll that way. So please do so if you would like. And I'll just give you a second so that you can access that. And if not, there will be other opportunities. You can always access the link through the chat and other opportunities through the session where we'll be showing this code. So I will move on to the first question. Now, you should have, if you've accessed the app, as you can see, we've had a couple of tests already, and I see many of you are already very familiar with this function. So please do select which sector do you currently work in, and do remember to press submit after you've done that. So as we'd expect, we've got a strong public sector representation here, and we have people from across sectors in the session, which is great to see as well. So I'll just give you another second if you'd like to give your answers on that. That's good. Seems people have got a good handle on that. Okay, we'll move. I believe we've got one more question, if I recall correctly. So this one requires a little bit more thought. To what extent is your organisation currently focused on helping people engage and benefit from the transition to a net zero future? So just good to get an idea of that here at the outset of the session, and give you some 15 seconds, 20 seconds just to give your own response, remembering to press submit. Very nice. Good to see it's among the priorities in different ways for very many of you. Very nice. Well, it seems you've got a good handle on that. If you have any queries or difficulties, please do say so in the chat, and we'll answer those ahead of the future questions in this live polling. And there we go. I'll move back to Liz.
Thanks very much, Ewan. That's excellent. Good start. And I think, yes, as we would have expected, you know, large proportion of our audience, a large proportion of our membership, frankly, is public sector. So we would expect that today. And I think it's also interesting to see that people are saying it's one of many top priorities. You know, I mean, kind of ironic, isn't it? Because a top priority should be a single priority, really. But people are clearly juggling a whole range of priorities right now. And that's one of the challenges, I think, as we do move forward. So we've got other questions that we'll come to as we progress through the afternoon as well. So without further ado, I want to start now by introducing our first speaker, who's Professor Dave Ray, who's Chair of Carbon Management and Education at Edinburgh University School of Geosciences, a graduate of marine biology from Liverpool University with a PhD focusing on global warming in the Southern Ocean, gained with the British Antarctic Survey and Essex University. It's fair to say that Dave was way ahead of the curve in identifying the impact of climate change from an early point. As well as research and teaching, he's an author of many books on environmental issues appealing to all ages. And I have to say, I do love this one, Dave, including A Kid's Guide to Going Green. I'm definitely going to check that one out. We're absolutely delighted to have you here today, Dave, and really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your overview on where we are now. And I think looking at your slides is going to be an entertaining presentation. So
thanks, Liz. Thanks for the build up, and thank you all for having me along today. Yeah, so I'm going to foolishly try and share my screen. I try and avoid using slides, but I thought I'd do a few. So let's see if this works. And hopefully that is coming up on your screens. Is that there, Liz? Give me a nod if it is. Yeah, fantastic. So given the topic of today's discussions around people, I mean, I've put climate is people as my title because it is. I mean, obviously, very fundamentally, the climate change we're seeing is down to human-induced emissions, the vast majority of it. But actually, all of the answers to addressing climate change, whether it's increased resilience, it's the net zero transition, it's making that a just one, like Katie will talk about. That is all about people. You know, our universities around the world will come up with shiny kits. They will come up with, I guess, across all the different sectors will have various tools, but they're only as good as the people who can then use them and implement them. And they're only as sustainable as those jobs and skills are. So yeah, so climate is people, definitely, in my view. In terms of that big picture view, I mean, it's inevitable in terms of climate action, like you all just did with the polling, is that we've got a lot of other things on our mind as well, particularly the pandemic. But there are lots of things which have at an international level been a distraction from climate action, but also are at our personal levels as well, and that's inevitable. I guess the key thing in terms of COVID-19 is that it can't stop us acting on climate change. We had a reduction in emissions last year globally of about 6 or 7%, but those emissions have rebounded. And so climate change hasn't gone away, as we've seen all over the world this year. Again, severe weather events made even more severe by the impacts of climate change. That's a continuing challenge. And if we take our eye off the ball this year and over this decade, we will have lost the fight to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change. We will lose the chance to meet the Paris climate goals. It's as simple as that. So making that kind of balance of priorities, however we do it, we've just got to do it. So make sure that recovery from COVID is truly green. The other really big context of this that we're also aware of is that we went into the pandemic with a lot of inequalities in our society, in Scotland, in the UK and globally. COVID has exacerbated those in many cases. Climate change will compound them even further. And so, yeah, that combination, that perfect storm, as I put here, of COVID, of inequality, of climate, that's what we're facing. But we have Port Glasgow. We have COP26 postponed from last year due to the pandemic, coming up very soon. And I think a lot of us are now getting excited, but also scared about how enormous those 2 weeks are going to be. They are going to define whether globally we can stay on track or get on track with the Paris climate goals, because we're not on track with them at the moment. They're huge for not just the coming decade, which is where the commitments are really focused, but actually for this century and centuries to come in terms of defining the climate. And as Scotland being host country for the COP, the eyes of the world will be on us. And I think we've got some amazing stories to tell and lots to discuss at COP26. So yeah, I'm really excited about that. So what I wanted to do was just flag from our perspective in Scotland, where we've got some big challenges, but particularly where people are really at the heart. So I'm just going to cover these 4 sectors, and I know there are many more, but these are high emitting sectors where we've got real urgent demands in terms of people driving change, allowing that transition to net zero to go at the speed we need in Scotland, which we know is really fast. We've got really ambitious targets to meet those. It does mean every sector, but I pulled out a few just as exemplars. So for the energy sector, I think it's one of the success stories globally we'll talk about at COP is our transition away from fossil fuels, the expansion of renewables. We're blessed with great wind and marine energy resources. And that has allowed us to decarbonize the electricity that's coming through our computers right now for this meeting is massively lower carbon than it was just 5 or 10 years ago. We've made huge leaps forward there. That expansion has got to continue, obviously, in terms of powering many other sectors, so giving us clean electricity for things like transport, for home heating, as well as making sure we can remove fossil fuels from the system completely. That really means a big transition, an ongoing transition for our energy system, and a huge role for people in that. We've got such a huge expert workforce in the oil and gas sector in Scotland. That sector itself can't go on as it is. You know, fossil fuels need to stay in the ground ultimately. So those skilled workers need other opportunities. They need that support, that just transition. I think they kind of almost define it, although I'll come in with some other definitions in terms of that transition to net zero needs to support the skilled people in Scotland to go into these greener jobs and upskill where required, as well as the kind of the new generations of school leavers and graduates going into these roles as well. In terms of transport, so I mentioned that briefly in terms of renewable energy. So this is a classic one for green recovery. What do we do now? We're starting to go back to work a bit. We're starting to get back into the car, probably more than the bus because of worries over COVID. So how is public transport behaviour going to go? Really importantly with this, how is it going to affect our emissions? It's our biggest source of emissions in Scotland. How are we going to behave as people, as our behaviour in terms of, is it going to be more online meetings? Are we going to be able to wean ourselves off fossil fuel cars? And certainly we've got legislation that will help drive that, but a lot of that does come down to us as individuals and our organisations in terms of our transport policy and how we implement the net zero transition. One of the major ones that we've seen kind of go wrong down south in the recent history is around buildings. We know in Scotland we've got the same challenge of we need to decarbonise the energy use in our homes in terms of heating. And the Green Homes Grant scheme down south had many issues with it, but one of the key pinch points was people. It was having the capacity for anyone who wanted to change the heating in their home and increase the energy efficiency to find skilled people who could do the work for them. And that's something that is crucial, is getting that time and place right in terms of the skills provision, so that even if you've got the funding, you've got all the will in the world, if the people aren't there to help deliver it, then it's going to fall flat on its face. So for me, that's a crucial lesson for us to learn in Scotland, as well as across the UK and globally, is that human capital underpins everything else in terms of the net zero transition. Just to give a mention as part of this, because I'm mainly talking about mitigation, so cutting emissions here, resilience is going to be a bigger and bigger theme, because climate change will continue to intensify. This is all about damage limitation in terms of global climate change. And so looking at those building retrofits, the new buildings, the same with roads, the same with the transport systems, the energy systems, they need to be resilient to future climate so that they are sustainable, so they are lasting. The final one, just to give a shout out for in terms of the sectors, is the one most dear to my heart, which is land use and agriculture. And this has such a huge role to play in Scotland and globally in terms of net zero transition, allowing us to sequester carbon and certainly reduce a lot of the emissions from land use change. Post membership of the European Union, we've got this huge challenge actually in terms of what rural support looks like. How does that align with net zero, with dealing with the nature crisis? Most importantly for this sector, I think, is the just transition question about how do farmers, how do land users, who should be the champions and are the champions often of net zero transition, how can they be supported in different ways of working, in different ways of farming to reduce emissions and increase that resilience again? So final couple of slides. One, I had to mention this, and Marissa will talk more about this, and hopefully you all have read it and are implementing it, the Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan. I guess the key messages for me that come from that are that every job can be, and probably has to be, a green job in terms of realising the net zero transition, that we've all got a massive job to do to inspire people into a green career, to show what it looks like, to map out those pathways and make them accessible to everyone in Scotland, so that you can follow that green career pathway from, like it says here, if you're 5 or 105, it should be relevant and it should be attractive and it should be something which is supported, so that lifelong approach. I mentioned place and time. That's going to be so crucial for us in terms of where the jobs will be created, where the skills are required and how they're supported. And looking at that kind of granular level is a real job for all of you, for Skills Development Scotland, for all of us to feed into it and actually be dynamic because of the speed we've got to go at. Ultimately, this is going to underpin, like I say, the transition for net zero for all. And really, everyone says I'm being a climate scientist, I'm always over optimistic, but I am probably the most optimistic I've been since I was on that ship in the Southern Ocean that Liz mentioned when I was doing my PhD, because where we are now, we're looking at some form of recovery from COVID and making that green. We've seen investment around the world channel towards green investment much more strongly than after the financial crisis. We have got a climate emergency, a nature crisis, we've got these inequalities, but actually directing investment and support, getting this right in terms of the education, skills and jobs for net zero, that can help address all of these things. Like I say here, education and skills, all of these challenges, people are at the heart of them all. And yeah, it really excites me where we're at already in Scotland. Well, we've got a big job, but with the people of Scotland, yeah, we can really do it and tell our story at COP26 too. Thank you.
Just unmuting myself there. Thanks, Dave. That was fantastic. Really good overview for us. Just setting the scene. I was actually going to ask you how optimistic you are about this agenda, but you kind of answered that. I suppose when you started off on this journey all those years ago, I wonder if you actually ever anticipated the extent to which it would be central, so central to policy making and focus, you know, in the decades ahead. I don't imagine did you think that? Did you think it was coming?
Yeah, it became clear that even back then we had pretty good projections about how climate was going to change, how much warming. I think we all thought we would publish lots of reports through the IPCC and other venues, and governments would go, wow, we need to act on this fast, and so we would avoid where we are now. And that didn't happen. But what has happened, not because of the scientists, but because of people like Greta Thunberg, actually, and just a real awakening up, like we've seen in Scotland, but around the world. Now governments do seem to really get it, and they also are empowered or even push beyond where they want to go on climate policy because of that awareness, that understanding the reality of climate. So I wish we had that kind of 25, 30 years again to go back and go, look, you know, we can do this much more cheaply and easily now than we're doing it in 2021, but at least we're starting to do it now, which is, yeah, really good to see.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Dave. Moving swiftly on, because I do want to make sure we keep to time here. I'm now going to move on to Marissa Olympia, who is Head of Climate Emergency and High Value Manufacturing at Skills Development Scotland. A position, Marissa, I believe you took on from May this year. And prior to this, you were Head of Resource Efficiency at Zero Waste Scotland, with a particular focus on how to deliver sustainable change in how society consumes and produces products and services. So given the focus, this massive focus on skills and employment opportunities around net zero, I'm sure it's fair to say you've probably come in and had to hit the ground running in your new role. So we're really delighted you found the time to be here with us today and to share your thoughts on where this is heading.
Yes, thanks very much, Liz. It has been it's been a fast 4 months. I think 4 months now. It has been non-stop, and there's so much going on. It's all really good stuff. Now I'm going to share my screen and just check that everyone can see that. Is that, yeah, good, great. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and following on from Dave's excellent presentation, what I'm going to do today is really take a broad look at the skills challenges facing Scotland at this time, and then look specifically at how we're responding to the greatest of all of these, which, as we know, is helping Scotland become a net zero nation by 2045. And so we'll take a look at the Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan. And I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what green jobs and skills mean in this context for Scotland, and highlight the 5 areas of opportunity, very similar to the ones that Dave has actually already highlighted, that make a significant contribution to the net zero transition in Scotland. And I'll outline also the aims of the recently launched Green Jobs Workforce Academy in supporting upskilling and retraining, which is really important as we move on, as we move forward. And then I'll share with you just the next steps for the implementation of the Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan, which I'll start to call CSAP from now on, and end with a bit of a consideration of how the transition to net zero will differ across local authority areas. And we'll have a bit of a discussion around that. So whilst the climate emergency remains the single biggest long-term challenge for the skills landscape, certainly, as well as the general economy in Scotland, it can't be viewed in isolation. The impacts of measures to control the spread of the COVID-19 virus have already impacted heavily on many of Scotland's sectors and could have a lasting effect on both work and skills provision. Sectors hardest hit are experiencing ongoing challenges, and nearly a third of businesses, as you know, have reported lower turnover than usual during the summer, which is a peak time of the year, and it was particularly acute for the accommodation and food services sectors, as well as the arts and entertainment and recreation sectors. And then in terms of Brexit, academic evidence suggests that the UK's exit from the EU has already had an impact on investment in the economy with reduced investment and changes in productivity and migration. So at the moment, we're seeing the combined impacts of COVID-19 and Brexit play out with labour shortages across road haulage, construction, hospitality and the food and drink sectors at the moment. We have a demographic challenge. Alongside migration flows, this is a principal influence on the supply of people to the labour market. So the ageing of Scotland's population, which is projected for the next 20 years and beyond, raises challenges in terms of the skills supply and the size of the working age population. And to add to that, we have the growing importance of data and digital innovations, which are increasingly bringing about major changes in the nature of employment and the demand for skills required to make Scotland a more competitive economy. And it's estimated that possibly up to 3 in 10 jobs in Scotland involve tasks that are at high risk from automation. So we have some significant challenges facing the economy. However, the transition to net zero brings with it transformational opportunities for Scotland. So just a little bit of background. In the response to the Scottish Government's declaration of the climate emergency and the ambition for Scotland to become a net zero nation by 2045, the Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan was developed by Skills Development Scotland, and that was published at the end of last year in December, along with the Scottish Government's Climate Change Plan update. So the CSAP supports the opportunity to create and maintain good green jobs as part of the green recovery, and it provides a framework for the skills investment that is needed for Scotland to successfully transition to net zero. And the plan recognises that the transition to a thriving and inclusive net zero economy is a transformational opportunity for Scotland. However, as Dave pointed out, the pace and the scale of the transition will also bring with it some risks and disruptions as communities and industries and supply chains adapt. For example, if we look at certain carbon intensive activities, such as those linked to fossil fuels, those will need to scale back quite significantly over the next 10 years or so. In terms of leadership, the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership recognises that the transition towards more resilient, sustainable and inclusive net zero business models, which were once seen as a bit of a peripheral issue, to be honest, are now central to strategic business planning. And it's recognised that there is a growing business need for individuals who understand the impact of climate change on a company's operations, on their supply chains, and also on the interdependencies that those organisations have with the wider economy and society at large. So critically, the transition to net zero will see increased demands for new jobs, new skill sets, with many occupations needing to adapt to new regulatory or technical requirements. And this requires a focus on upskilling and reskilling to allow redundant workers and those in occupations that are going to be at risk to update their skills and take advantage of emerging opportunities in the green economy. So the Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan for Scotland sets out a framework for collaborative action required by individuals, employers, education and the skills system so that we can maximise the benefits from the transition to net zero. And it focuses on 5 areas of economic activity highlighted here. And those are the areas that make a significant contribution to the net zero transition and also reflect national priorities to reduce energy demand and emissions. So built on the best available evidence, the CSAP considers the skills implications for each of these areas and also considers implications for rural and urban communities. Now, we're all searching for a single definition for green jobs and green skills. But what I think the CSAP helpfully does is it categorises green jobs in a way that helps the transition to net zero remain inclusive. And those categories are here. It's new and emerging jobs that relate directly to the transition to net zero, jobs affected by the transition to net zero that will need enhanced skills or competencies, and existing jobs that will be needed in greater numbers as the result of the transition to net zero. And many of our new green jobs will emerge as a result of the transformation of existing roles. For example, as heating engineers switch to installing heat pumps instead of gas boilers, or as car manufacturers increasingly switch production away from petrol-powered vehicles, so our car mechanics will have to learn how to work with new ultra-low emissions vehicles. And some of our industries, for example, oil and gas extraction, there are going to be new jobs, there's going to be displaced jobs, and there's going to be job losses driven by both the changing demand and the impact of regulation, all intended to reduce emissions. And it's widely recognised that skills development is central to delivering and benefiting from that transition to net zero. So we recognise and we understand how important skills in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering and maths are. But we'll also see opportunities emerge for workers in a wide range of roles, including lower skilled roles. Now, one of the key priorities of our Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan is to support transitioning and upskilling to meet emerging green jobs skills needs. And through the creation of a Green Jobs Workforce Academy, we'll help people upskill and retrain. And in the transition to net zero, it's essential to be able to help existing and displaced workers adapt to new roles, new tasks, and actually new techniques too. Research suggests that workers in construction, manufacturing, the motor trades and transport sectors are likely to be the most affected by the transition. So let's have a look at the Green Jobs Workforce Academy. Phase 1 was launched recently, and it's designed to provide a seamless, accessible and online resource for individuals, really at any stage of their career, to find out more about the skills that they'll need to access or progress in jobs that will support the transition to net zero. And individuals will be able to access training opportunities, many of which will be free to support their career path. And where there are costs associated with training, individuals will be signposted to appropriate funding support where that's available and as it develops over time. And it's designed to be interactive, responsive to data and user feedback, and regularly updated. And the advice service and a new skills assessment tool, which we're planning for the second phase of development, will allow users to understand the concept of green skills and to appreciate where the skills they have acquired from previous employment can be transferred into new roles. And in addition, it recommends more advanced learning in the context of some specific industries and their own transition to net zero. And it focuses on helping people understand how they can access training and opportunities within the 5 areas highlighted here. For example, in the energy transition, at Skills Development Scotland, we estimate from our skills sector assessments that close to 15,000 new workers will be required during the transition to net zero over the longer term. So through the Academy, we provide an outline of current roles and indicate where new roles will exist, as well as helping people to understand how to break into the various industries and sectors they might be interested in. And it highlights particularly current college and university courses, modern and graduate apprenticeships, as well as signposting to other courses that will help people build their everyday skills and knowledge in terms of opportunities. So if we look at construction, now in the programme for government, Scottish Government has committed to investing at least £1.8 billion over this Parliament in decarbonising Scotland's homes and buildings. So that's about converting at least, I think, 1 million homes and 50,000 non-domestic buildings to lower zero emissions heating by 2030. This will bring a vast number of opportunities across Scotland. Transport Scotland's rail decarbonisation plan indicates that there'll be significant prospects for the creation of more skilled, sustainable jobs in Scotland. And these jobs will be in the direct provision of electrification, as well as in the supply of rolling stock and advanced technologies in the design of alternative traction methods. And that will complement the electrification of the network. And agriculture and land use. Again, in the programme for government, there's a commitment to invest £500 million in our natural economy, including expansion of the Nature Restoration Fund, creating local nature networks and increased forestry and peatland. And it's also committing to delivering at least 3 carbon neutral islands by 2040, and that in itself will create jobs as well as protect the island environments from climate change. And to add to that, there's going to be investment of an additional 500 million to support the new good green jobs of the future, including upskilling and reskilling people to access those jobs. So there's lots of opportunity and investment coming, which I think is really, really positive. So quickly, just to take you through the next steps that we have for implementing the Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan. It was developed through collaboration and partnership, and the actions and priorities in the plan will be delivered also through collaboration and partnership. And the priorities that I've outlined here are those that are being mobilised as part of delivering, as I said, and implementing the CSAP. There's no real need to duplicate these at a regional level, but rather consider how this can act as a framework, I think, for a regional response. Just to pick out 1 or 2 areas, the Green Jobs Skills Hub, which we're developing with Zero Waste Scotland, will complement the Green Jobs Workforce Academy and will cascade intelligence into the skills system on the numbers and the types of green jobs that will be available over the next 25 years. And it will play a central role in raising awareness amongst employers and individuals of the need for behaviour change, and support them to take action to drive behaviour change and develop the leadership and management skills that will be required as in our future. So as part of the transition to net zero too, the skills system has a key role to play in understanding changing demands. This was touched on before, it's tailoring the supply of skills to meet a growing demand and mitigating risks as they arise and supporting individuals to secure emerging opportunities. That balance is difficult, but it's necessary. The anticipated disruption to labour markets can be mitigated by investment in skills to support people to move into sustainable, resilient jobs in the net zero economy. We need an adaptive skills system. That's vital to maintaining the productive performance of our economy, and it's also through retraining people and people that are at risk that will make sure that our transition is a just and inclusive transition. So just to close, the transition to net zero will, as we know, affect all of us on all parts of Scotland. However, we do need to have tailored approaches in place to capitalise on different regional opportunities. So sectors, timescales and opportunities will all be different across regions. For example, as we know, the decline of the traditional oil and gas sector in the North East has been accelerated by recent events, but so too that sector can embrace the opportunities of the energy transition. So regardless of the differences, it's critical that if much of our workforce in 2045 is in our current workforce today, which it is, it's critical that we upskill and we reskill the workforce to be able to benefit from that transition and deliver a just transition. So it will require continuous and collaborative engagement to ensure understanding of distinctly local opportunities and distinctly local challenges. So really the question or challenge at the local level is, how do we collaborate effectively as local authorities, third sector organisations, public sector agencies and the private sector to inspire and empower our young people to engage with the transition to net zero, to build the talent pipeline that we need for the transition, to support affected workers to transition and upskill to meet new green jobs, and also to support local businesses to capitalise on the net zero transition opportunities. Economic development partners have the skills, I think the resources, the abilities and the influence to be able to help make this happen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marissa. That was really excellent, a really thorough and comprehensive overview of the response that Skills Development Scotland is bringing to this agenda and driving the agenda. And in actual fact, I think if anybody was in any doubt about how seismic the change and the shift is, I think your presentation there really kind of nailed that and gave us a sense of that. I suppose perhaps just before we get into some of the questions, because I think there are a couple of questions that have come in, I'm just wondering what has been your response to this to both the skills action plan, but also the academy and the direction of travel. I know there's obviously a lot of focus on young people and opportunities and particular sectors, but I'm wondering, is there a sense for some that this is also big and so also dynamic and so significant that in actual fact, perhaps for older generations, they might be thinking, you know what, this is just too much. I'm likely to be left behind. The changes are so significant. I just wonder if you have if you're picking up anything or what you're feeling from that.
Yeah, the responses we've had so far are fairly positive, but you're absolutely right. I think it can become very quickly overwhelming. And we need to avoid that, but we just need to recognise that there's changes required across all parts of society. And what I found is that working with the sort of individual sectors, understanding the transition and how that's communicated, and making sure that we highlight the opportunities that are there for people, and makes a big difference. So it is about how we communicate and how inclusive we can be as well in that communication. I think it might be easy for some people to think this is just about energy. This is not just about energy, as Dave said at the start, every job really, because of the way we're transitioning, has to be a kind of green job. And I think that all parts of society that are engaged in this have a role to play.
It's quite interesting, and I was just reflecting on how a number of years ago now, quite a number of years ago, I worked for an organisation called the WISE Group, which was a leader in intermediate labour markets and in energy efficiency, and it actually focused on home insulation and energy advice and so on. And it does feel as though to some extent perhaps it was ahead of its time, but there are examples from the past that actually could probably be brought forward as part of the planning in all of this. It's not as though we're starting with a completely blank sheet on some of this, but those programs were really good probably at the lower end of the scales spectrum in terms of trying to address those issues of people who are distanced from the labour market.
Yeah, but I think you're absolutely right there, Liz, because I think what we can do is learn and understand and think, okay, so what's happened in that gap, and were there some barriers, and how do we overcome those, and how do we understand what to do in those areas, and I think retrofitting, for example, and also having how we work with not just the people who are going to be reskilled in that sense, but also those homeowners and tenants and people that are resident in all these buildings. How do we encourage them to be, I suppose, to welcome what's coming?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Marissa. That was excellent. I'd now like to open up the questions. I'd like to invite Dave back in if he's available. And yeah, if we can maybe get, I don't know if we can get people on the screen, but I'm conscious there are a couple of questions in the chat, but I'm really keen to, without putting you on the spot, Suzanne, I can see there's a question come in from Suzanne, and it has been answered by Dave. But Suzanne, would you mind just repeating your question for the benefit of the audience? And say who you are as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no worries. I've just taken myself off mute there. I just sometimes trying to understand, I guess, from a small consultancy, and I'm on the board at EDAS as well, David and Marissa, and it's that bit about how would I then, as a small kind of economic development consultancy, actually create a green job for maybe like if we take on interns or new analysts or new consultants, like how do because I find that difficult to think how then I would then make my jobs green, so to speak, as a owner of the business. And in thinking about it, it's not that we haven't then looked over the years, because even before COVID kicked in, we had a policy of public transport, we get rid of company cars, we discourage business, all of those different things to minimise our ultimately carbon footprint. Yeah. And you think, well, what could I do then to make like somebody new coming in or something like that a green job, or greenify the jobs or something? So it was just kind of, because I'm sure there's loads of people out there thinking something similar when you're not in renewables or you're not in those kind of sectors, the energy ones or the the construction ones, where you can start to see how some of those things easily can fit into that. So that was my question.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I put a bit of response in the text. I think part of it is about the definition. So if you're tightly saying I like a green job being something which directly contributes to net zero, and so that kind of gives you a fairly narrow definition. But I suppose, just like Jean's saying as well in the text, actually this is about greening all jobs. So what you've done with your existing staff and the ones who are coming in is you're looking at the skills they need, the training they need, and actually for the net zero transition across all of our sectors, that's got to be greened in terms of, you know, what their skill set is, what their induction is, what career that path they're going to follow. So it might be, in terms of the definition, useful for governments to say how many green jobs they've created. Really what matters is how much we've greened all the jobs, including our own. And so part of it is bean counting, and that's not very useful. What's more important is, you know, what matters. And so for, you know, basically, I think all jobs will be greened. They will have green elements to them. They will have green practices, even if what we count as strictly green jobs is something which is a tighter definition. That would be my view.
Could I come in there
Marissa,
too?
did you want to come in? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, Suzanne, I think also think about the type of work that you're doing. I mean, you know, consultants, analysts, and interns. I imagine what will happen is that over time we will see the influence of procurement and the types of contracts and the types of work that will be coming into a number of different types of organisations in itself will be focused too on that transition to net zero. And so whilst you'd be training people within your organisation, they will also be influenced by the work that's coming in. So you also have I guess in some ways, a choice to make in terms of the type of work that you do. But I think we will increasingly see through procurement and through the types of work that's been specified in future, there'll be a focus very much on transition to net zero and how things are done.
To unmute myself, sorry about that. Thanks very much, Marissa. Thanks to both of you. We do have a few other questions. I'm going to bring them up just now, but firstly, before I take the questions in the chat box, can I ask Charlie Woods to come in? I think you have your hand up, Charlie. Would that be right?
Yep. Thanks, Liz, and thanks both of you for great presentations. Marissa, you were talking about developing the skills system to get the balance right between stimulating demand on the one hand and having a supply response with the right skills on the other. Dave, you mentioned the experience in England with an initiative which I think around housing changes, which didn't work so well. Are there any lessons to be learned from that in terms of getting the balance of demand and supply right?
Hello,
can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar necessarily, Charlie, with that trial, but I certainly think it was something that we should look at. I think that the balance of demand and supply is really difficult. So I think what we have to do, and I know this is going to be difficult, but I think we have to accept that there will be some risks, and I suppose to some degree highlight that at the start, and almost have a propensity for risk, and accept that everything won't happen quite as we want it to do in the first instance. But I think that it will shape up over time. It's not, I don't know the specific as I say, trial that you mentioned, but I think that there's something about our ability to take risk and be comfortable with that in trying to make that balance work.
Totally. So the Green Homes grant scheme down south was huge. So less a trial and more a kind of flagship policy for decarbonising domestic heat in England, and they only hit, I think, less than 10% of their target in terms of about 10% of the number of homes that they achieved, and things were much more expensive. A lot of homeowners who wanted to be part of the scheme complained they just couldn't find a contractor to do it. The contractors didn't have enough of a clear market signal to put the people in place. So, getting it right in terms of time and space on that front was a trick missed in terms of the UK government, and they're going to have another go at it, so we'll see how they do. But it's something we can learn from in Scotland. Marissa's point's spot on in terms of this is we have to take some risks, but we can also learn from what industry bodies are telling us and employers are telling us, you know, in terms of existing gaps and skills that they need right now, you know, both in place and in time. And some of the organizations like Scandinavia, I know Finland have a kind of an anticipation body, which actually looks at this and kind of goes, okay, these are the big signals coming down the line in terms of policy, particularly national policy, but also international. And so this is where we've got a risk in terms of skills gaps. So that intelligence, I suppose, that anticipation ability, a lot of that we've got, but it's in pockets. It talks to one of the other questions about how we link these things up. We've got a lot of this going on, which is within a certain business, you know, they've got a strategy and they've identified these gaps, but it's making sure that communication goes all the way actually through to central government to say, this is what needs to be put in place in our schools, our colleges, our unis, in terms of private training as well, so that we don't end up with all the best will in the world, like I said, big money, but actually nothing happening on the ground. We can't afford that to happen.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. Thanks for those responses, folks. And we're getting quite a few questions coming in. So I am going to try and make this interactive, so I hope you don't object, but Alan Hendry has raised a question about leadership. Alan, would you be happy to come in?
Yes.
Yeah, good.
Hi, Marissa. Do this. Hi, Marissa. Yeah, it was really on this thing of leadership. So, you know, if we look around at all the things we've done really well in Scotland around decarbonisation, sustainability, you can identify the key leaders who've really driven it. Because in terms of the kind of policy backdrop, it's obviously very supportive. And as I say, if you know where to find funding, that can be available too. But without that leadership, we don't really move things at the scale and pace we need to. So I was wondering, in terms of the strategy, how you kind of support those leaders who want to really move this agenda.
What we're trying to do, Alan, is I kind of touched on one of our next developments, which is the Green Jobs Skills Hub, which maybe I'll change its name, but that's about really having a knowledge hub and a way for employers and those who are, I think, leading in this field, being able to bring others along and share knowledge and experience. So our plan is that almost an employer hub, if you like, leadership hub, would then feed in information to all the other parts of what we're trying to do, specifically in the Green Jobs Workforce Academy. So that's right. The plan. And I agree. And I think one of the things we're finding across different sectors for some of the work we're doing just now is actually we're looking for some of those skills that you would call leadership skills, or the ability to do a little bit of forward business planning almost, coming through at all different levels, which is really interesting.
Sorry, just a supplementary one was about working across silos, because particularly in terms of our education, we train people to do a thing, but with a more sustainable solution, often it's about joining things up. How do we train people better to have an awareness how they can work collectively and in partnership with others?
Yeah, and one of I guess what's referred to just now as meta skills is an area that we are really focusing on too, because the technical skills are important, but actually you're right, there are kind of categories of skills whereby, you know, the need for collaboration, the ability to think creatively, the ability to kind of, you know, bring different ways of thinking together across different disciplines, I think is really important too. So there's a recognition, and I think there's a recognition too in the skills system that we need to broaden out beyond just technical skills, but think of some of these other skills that are going to be so important to avoid silos.
Great, thanks.
Okay, and interesting, Alan, because those 2 points that you've brought up, we were actually discussing at our EDAS board this morning. I think it's coming up here, but it's coming up across a whole range of development activities that we're talking about, including things like community wealth building. You know, so it's leadership and working across partnerships and breaking down those silos it's really key to making all of these agendas successful. I'd like to, again, forgive me, Jean, but would you mind coming in? You've raised an interesting question, Jean Hamilton, about supply side plans. So can I bring you in?
Yeah, I think it was covered partly by the response to Charlie's question, but thinking about the Green Homes Initiative, and Marissa highlighting all these new, I think it was Marissa, all this extra money that's coming to Scotland to do all sorts of major green things. I'd like to think there was a skills and employment plan attached to every single one of those pots of money. If I'm cynical, I would say probably not. But the approach that will avoid this green, the equivalent to what happened down south. So that, I suppose that's one point. The other thing, which I'm a consultant and I do a lot of economic appraisal and evaluation. And so what I do is very steeped in numbers. And I'm now increasingly encountering clients that are wanting to look at environmental impact as well, but they're really struggling. They don't really know how to measure it. I don't really know how to measure it. I can't believe there aren't ways to measure it, but so I think there's a reskilling of us as a sector. And I suppose that's my point of why don't we become EDAS?
Suggestion.
Just to pick up on that point, Jean, I think it goes back a bit to the leadership question as well, in terms of I guess in a lot of our roles, we're outward facing. We're kind of going, okay, this is where there's a skills gap. This is where jobs need to be created. These are the things which need to be put in place. Actually, there's also that gap, whether you're looking at public sector and local authorities, you're looking at CEOs, you're looking for the capacity within our own organisations actually to be able to do this, whether it's just the kind of I guess the market intelligence, the anticipation, or just the capacity we've got, the human capital within our organisations. So I am not in any way sponsored by them, but if I was going to invest heavily, it would be in organisations like SDS, because in terms of a just transition to net zero, that's the kind of organisation where you want a lot of capacity to help all of us do what we want to do. So I think that point's really well made, that actually capacity it's not just about reskilling people in different sectors or school leavers, giving them opportunity. Actually, it's about us as well. We need to be greened as well as everyone else.
Okay, thanks, folks. I'm going to there are two more questions in the chat box, and I'm actually going to do it in kind of reverse order. Oh no, there's another one coming. So I'm trying to multitask with a laptop and a phone here. Okay, so if we can take, I think if I can ask Claire McLeod. Claire, would you be happy just to raise the point, because I think it links to just what was being said previously there in the discussion. If I can maybe take your question first about the desire to create manufacturing jobs.
Yeah, I was interested to know, just again, there's another company just got into administration this week, which was manufacturing in wind turbines. And we've done a lot of work. I'm Scottish Enterprise, by the way. I work for Scottish Enterprise and into the entrepreneurship team. But we're looking at a lot of companies who have got ideas for the net zero, even down to things like parts of the wind turbines that they're trying to manufacture in recyclable ways, instead of a lot of what makes up about a wind turbine is not easily renewable. So, but however, an overriding question for a lot of these new ideas, and for which we rightly want to train people and skill people up for, is that they are created thousands of miles away. And it's how best that we can, as a country, look at bringing those jobs here so that nothing's travelling as far, and it's also much better for us in terms of innovation and trying to look at every single piece of something that we are manufacturing that can be renewable in itself. And the whole way the company works, it's much, much easier if we can do it here. And I wondered what the appetite was for that in Scotland, and if anybody had anything that they could add to that discussion.
So really quickly, I imagine Claire Mack will pick this up as well later on. I think there's huge appetite and desire, both from government, but from all, from the employers, everyone else. So it is a case of taking that systems view, whether it's renewables, but the other sectors as well, thinking about our forestry and how that links with the built environment, and actually being able to support more timber builds. It's an approach which just makes good sense in terms of jobs, in terms of efficiency, in terms of the net zero transition. And I think things like Siemens are doing with their recyclable or reusable blades and looking at sustainability of that kind of comes back to what we aspire to in Scotland, which is a circular economy, and that would include the human capital part of that, in terms of, you know, being able to think about your wind turbine being built here and used here, and all the jobs and skills that go into that being in Scotland too. That would be amazing, I think.
Okay, Marissa, do you have anything to add to that?
Just quickly to say that, you know, in Skills Development Scotland, we do have a team absolutely focused on inward investment and growth, work very closely, as you probably know, Claire, with Scottish Enterprise. And I think, just to really echo what Dave said, I think there's absolutely a really strong appetite to bring those good, if you like, opportunities to manufacture here, to have industry here. There, and so we do support that, and we are working with quite a few organisations at the moment, really interesting ones actually. So yeah, and probably not much more to add to that, just to say that we're supporting the inward investment and growth side of things.
And I think we will, as you say, pick up on this in the next part of today's session. So thanks for that, Claire. I want to bring in one final question and some observations from my colleague David McIntosh. David, are you available? You've put, essentially you're talking about scale here. So do you want to put your points on?
Yeah, just a really quick point, really. I thought it was an excellent presentation so far. And you're kind of into the territory of entrepreneurial state for transition to net zero. The market in a lot of these places isn't ready to move yet because it's not commercially viable. So I'm really interested in where collaborative public sector organisations, where we've got an element of control, can actually start to make some big structural changes. So classic one would be in the energy efficiency space, where a lot, you know, all social housing builds in Scotland are subsidised by the government. Another one would be in land management and peat restoration, where a lot of that's going to be public funding supporting that. So to what extent can we use those levers to really create, you know, change at scale? I think a really good example would be when they devolved out the housing associations, you know, 20 years ago, from public sector local authorities to private sector organisations. That was a big structural change. Lots of people working on it, big scale. I think we need to replicate structures like that for net zero over the next few years. So yeah, question is, to what extent are we doing that, and how do we do that at a bit more pace?
Not an easy one to answer.
None of it's easy, Liz.
Yeah, just on the woodlands and peatlands. So woodland carbon code, peatland carbon code, and now the farm carbon code that's being developed. So there's a lot of work gone on in terms of, I suppose, them being robust and the safeguarding around it, because you know, there's a lot of offset schemes around the world which purport to meet those kind of carbon benefits and maybe don't, or they haven't got the permanence, or they aren't about actually sequestering carbon here in Scotland, which we can do a significant amount of. So that for me is a sector where it's a perfect example where you need public sector support to provide that safeguarding, to make sure that there's a good standard in terms of how our land is being used, if it's being used for carbon sequestration. What you want with that is government to get to the stage, I think, or public funds to get to the stage where they're no longer needed. So you've got that structure, sometimes through regulation, certainly through standard setting, but the demand from the market is massive for the kind of carbon sequestration we can deliver in certain parts of Scotland. And that's a risk for a lot of our communities, for all my neighbours. We're all we know we can make quite a lot of money out of it at the moment, but we also know that's a real risk in terms of how we use our land, how our communities function. So that's where, for me, government, either central or local, has a real part to play in helping ensure we're safeguarding and we're making that transition just and sustainable. But actually the money for a lot of that change is going to come from private sector. So big role for both. And I think we're not there yet by any means in terms of exactly how to do it, but we've got, like I say, through the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Carbon Code, we have got a really good basis for how to do it and how to safeguard those kind of land use changes, just for that sector as an example.
Okay, Marissa, anything to add? don't worry if you haven't, because we're slightly over time, but if there's anything you want to add briefly.
Really, it is a massive challenge getting the scale. I think the key thing there is it has to be a mix of public and private sector investment. And again, I'd just pick up on the risk side of things. But yeah, I mean, there's some interesting things going on in different sort of regions and parts of the economy, but it's very early days. But a challenge we can't ignore.
Okay, there are a couple of more points I'm just going to read because I want to wind things up here because we want to do just a bit more polling before we go to the break. There's a question from Donna, and apologies, Donna, I'm just going to read this out just for speed, where you were asking, is there a central source of qualifications or training for green skills where the level of eligibility is identified? And obviously that I presume is for you, Marissa, really. Yes, no, and if so, where?
So what we're trying to do, as we continue to develop the Green Jobs Workforce Academy, we're going to narrow that down further and further and further to sort of be clear in terms of which college courses, etc., are specifically for green skills. But I would say at the moment that, as described, doesn't probably exist. But the way we can help through the Green Jobs Workforce Academies, we're really trying to kind of narrow it down. So that would be the main source, I think, at the moment for ourselves. But it's ongoing research that we're doing.
Okay, that's great. And I just want to read out a comment from Tanya, who is Tanya Aliot, who's a Rural Development Officer at Cairngorms National Park Authority. And she said, I think it's a really nice way to end this session. She's saying, every course in Scotland from primary to tertiary and apprenticeship needs a module that begins with consideration of the planet's resources and their finite nature and how humanity uses these resources. And I couldn't agree more. So I think that that's a good way for us to end this session. Okay, so we're just going to move on briefly to a little bit more polling, and then we're going to take a quick break. But can I thank Marissa and Dave for really tremendous contributions there to get our conference started. I'm not sure if you're able to stay on for the full session. Would love it if you can. But just in case you're having to leave, I just want to thank you on behalf of EDAS for taking time today. It's been tremendous. So Ewan, do you want to take us to the poll, the next part?
Of course. Hello again, everybody. And I'll just share my screen. So hopefully you will be able to see the QR code again, just if you haven't already accessed the Menti online poll that we've got. And you can, of course, just leave that on your phone if you're watching on a laptop, for example, and keep that open for future questions. So the code's been posted in the chat as well. So if you've not used the QR code, then please do just access the code in the chat. Now, we're going to leave this open for you to answer throughout the break because it takes a little bit more thought. What we're asking you to do here is rank your answers in order of importance, relevance to you, and then we'll view potentially at the end of the break then the final response. So the question is, what is or should be the biggest priority for your organization during the 2020s in engaging and supporting people in a just net zero transition? And in answering, you can select the first, the most important priority, click submit, and then repeat the same process, and the kind of list of available options will go shrinking down. So you can take a little bit of time to think about it. No, there's no rush, as we'll be going over the break. So read through the 6 and then just answer as is most appropriate for you.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Ewan. Okay, so we are going to take a short break just now. I think just a chance for everybody to go away and refill their coffee cups. So could I ask, we're slightly over, could I ask if everyone comes back into the room for 2:15 and we'll get on to the next set of speakers? That would be great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Okay, folks. Can I just get a heads up that it looks as though people are back in the room? Okay, hopefully everyone's had a chance to get some nice fresh coffee or whatever your tipple is. We're now just going to pick up one where we left off just before that short break. And Ewan, have we had, do we look as though we've had a good response? I can't tell from the numbers, apologies for
yeah.
how many people have responded.
So we've had just over 30 responding. So over half, just over half in here. So that's very good response rate and looking like a very balanced set of responses actually, maybe showing how important all of these points are for people's organizations. Absolutely.
And as you would expect with this audience, the skills reskilling dimension is obviously up there first, but actually very encouraging to see that about building a well-being economy, which is actually a very nice link, I think, to our next speaker who we're going to invite to come forward now. We're going to kick off the second part of the session this afternoon with Katie Fair, who's head of the Just Transition Policy Unit in the Climate Change Division at the Scottish Government. And a post that she took up in March of this year. Again, I can only imagine the immense pressure that you must be under right now with everything that's going on, Katie. So again, thank you for being here and for giving us your time. Prior to taking up this role, you were head of the Climate Emergency Strategy Team in Scottish Government from August 2019. So for the last number of years, this has been really kind of front and centre of your work and your thinking. And I believe you're passionate about this agenda and really committed to leading a team within government that will ensure the opportunities from net zero also address poverty and inequality, something that we in EDAS are very much supportive of as we take our strategy forward. So can I just hand over to you, Katie, to begin your presentation? And I don't think you have presentation. I'm just going to talk.
No, thanks, Liz. I don't have slides because basically I'm concerned my IT would collapse in on itself like a dying star if I did. So it's just my face, I'm afraid. Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here. I enjoyed the LinkedIn sleuthed introduction there as well. So yeah, climate change has really been what I've been doing for the past few years. This role is new. It really reflects, I think, the scale of our focus on just transition. And just to reflect on the speakers earlier, I thought Marissa and Dave were typically brilliant, and I really agree with that kind of sense of cautious optimism that they were highlighting, and the kind of seismic scale of transition, Liz, that you were touching on. I think Dave McIntosh summed it up well when he just said that none of this is easy. It really isn't. It's really complicated. So yeah, delighted to be getting stuck into it. So for those of you who are interested in Just Transition, you may have noticed that we published our response to the Commission on Tuesday alongside the Programme for Government, and it sets out some really big policy commitments, things like a skills guarantee for those in carbon intensive sectors, a new approach to green participatory budgeting, our position on carbon pricing, which is going to become increasingly important, I think, not just for those who are currently caught under the emissions trading scheme, but potentially for other sectors too. And also we published our new national just transition planning framework as part of that response. So I'm going to focus primarily on the framework and giving you a bit of a run through of what's in that, because I'd be very, very impressed if anybody's actually had a chance to read the response yet. But hopefully this will give you a bit of a starter for 10 on it, and then you can go away and read all of our laborious work that we spent so much time thinking about. I'm also going to start off though by talking about the definition of a just transition. We've sort of touched on a few different definitions of things today, and one of the things we really wanted to do in the response was to clearly set out what the Scottish Government believed a just transition was, and allow everything to kind of flow from that definition. So I'll just read out what we included, so everybody's on the same page. So we said that, and I quote, a just transition is both the outcome, so that's a fairer, greener future for all, and the process that must be undertaken in partnership with those impacted by the transition to net zero. Just transition is how we get to net zero and a climate resilient economy in a way that delivers fairness and tackles inequality and injustice. So small aim that's really underpinning our wider approach to just transition. We were really keen to get that distinction between outcome, which is kind of the vision for 2045. And when you look at the response, you'll see that we've set out quite a detailed vision for what we think 2045 might look like if we manage to achieve a just transition. And it also really emphasizes the partnership process that will be needed to get us there. That bit in particular is essential. We must co-design each and every just transition plan. Government will not have all the answers. We will not have the lived experience. We will not have the business insights. We will not have the insight of workers. We won't have an on-the-ground understanding of the barriers to action without hearing from the people who are experiencing those barriers and are struggling to overcome them. So it's really, really important that we get that kind of massive amount of engagement in each of the plans. So I'm going to go through the planning framework in a very, hopefully, light touch way, but try and bear with me as I go through all the detail of this. So the framework covers a lot of ground. As I said, I would really encourage you to read it if you get the chance after this. So far, we've publicly committed to a just transition plan for energy, and we've also committed to do a just transition plan for agriculture and land use. But the programme for government gave a bit of a heavy hint about what might be coming, because it outlined that we are planning to do a just transition plan for every sector and also for every region. So these plans will really impact everybody on this call. We'll all have to get involved in them in some way, shape or form. So I wanted to firstly touch on the principles that we've said will underpin every single plan. And then we've identified a series of national just transition outcomes, which will have to be interpreted for each plan, because really you can't have an outcome and just apply it loosely to anything. It's got to be then interpreted into the context of which it's been applied. And then we've set out a kind of broad structure for each just transition plan. So I'll cover all of that, and then I'll finish talking about our approach to co-designing just transition plans. So the principles underpinning a plan. What I'm going to be talking about in these three sections is 4 principles, 8 outcomes, then back to 4 sections. So it's kind of a 4-8-4 structure. For the 4 principles, the first is that all plans should be evidence-led. The second is that they should be adaptable and iterative. So, for example, we've said that we would expect each plan to be reviewed during the climate change plan cycle, which is every 5 years, just to kind of anchor it in a point in time. We also expect that all plans would be co-designed and co-delivered. And like I said, I'll come back to that point at the end. We would also expect that they would be built upon existing work and experience. So where we don't have to remake the wheel, we shouldn't. For example, we have got an excellent climate emergency skills action plan. We don't need another one. We have got excellent roadmaps for particular technologies, such as the Nexus roadmap. We don't need another one. We just need to make sure that we're referencing back to existing pieces of work. So those 4 principles are then supported by the 8 outcomes. Now, I'll briefly go through these, and I'll try and touch on where they've been referenced in other questions as well, because I think particularly the points Jean was raising are kind of partially answered here. So the first is around citizens, communities in place. And basically, there should be an outcome which outlines how the plan will support affected regions by empowering and invigorating communities and strengthening local economies. So really core business for the likes of EDAS. The second would be around jobs, skills and education. So how the plan equips people with the skills, education and retraining required to support retention and to create access to green, fair and high value work. And Jean, I think this does start to meet your ask for a job and skills plan to go alongside investment, but there really is a strong onus on government and on others who are developing plans to really do that linkaging. The third would be around a fair distribution of costs and benefits. So how does the plan address existing economic and social inequality? How does it share the benefits of climate action widely? How does it ensure that costs are distributed on the basis of ability to pay, which is a really key principle in terms of just transition? The fourth would be around business and economy. How does the plan support a strong and dynamic and productive economy? How does it create wealth and high quality employment across Scotland and uphold kind of guiding principles on business and human rights from the UN? And how do we continue to make Scotland a great place to do business? We're about to enter a period of quite significant uncertainty and change as we transition to net zero. How do we retain business confidence and confidence in others to invest and work in Scotland during that period? And the fifth is around adaptation resilience. Dave touched on this a little bit in his talk as well. So a lot of the time when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about mitigation. Adaptation or resilience, however you want to put it, has kind of become the poor cousin to mitigation. And I think part of what we need to do is really push adaptation and resilience back up the agenda and make sure that it's, the key risks that are arising from climate change and the actions that we need to take to really build some resilience to those risks are being identified and are being funded as enthusiastically as mitigation efforts are. The sixth is around environmental protection and restoration, very much in line with the last comment that you highlighted, Liz. We do have planetary boundaries and we must act within them. We're seeing increasingly folks are focusing on things like Kate Raworth's donut economics model and how we have to have a much better understanding of the limits of our natural world. So it's really, really important that this also covers that. The seventh would be around decarbonization and efficiency. So basically, how does the plan contribute to resource efficient and sustainable economic approaches? So you're actively encouraging decarbonization in what you're doing, you're supporting low carbon investment in infrastructure, and you're also avoiding any kind of carbon lock-in that might come as part of that. And the last is around how does the plan kind of further equality and human rights implementation and prevent new inequalities from arising? So we hope that the plan will be able to address aspects of fuel poverty and child poverty in a manner that's consistent with Scotland's other statutory targets and really just furthering that work. So that's a lot of information, but I hope it gives a real sense of the breadth and the ambition that underpins each of these just transition plans. They're not net zero plans, they're net zero plans with all of these other elements kind of baked into them right from the beginning. So when it comes to structuring a just transition plan, like I said at the beginning, we've kind of got a 4-8-4. So this is our back to a 4. And the 4 parts of the just transition plan are as follows. So firstly, you should have a kind of context piece, which sets out why we're doing a just transition plan, what we already know, and preferably an analysis of the distribution of benefits and risks of the transition. Because again, that's we often focus on the challenges of net zero and of decarbonisation, and not so much on the benefits that could come with it. And as Marissa was saying earlier, really improving our comfort with risk, I think is going to be a critical part of our transition to net zero, because there will be plenty of things that we'll have to try and fail at before we reach something that really works for everyone. The second is around vision. So very much as it says in the tin, much as we've set out a vision for 2045, and in our document, each just transition plan should have a vision for the sector or the region that it is operating in. The third part is probably the most important part. It is the action plan. It should be the most substantial part of each plan. It should address questions like, what are we going to do and how we're going to do it? It should think about identifying, assessing and sequencing the actions that are needed to achieve the vision that's been set out. And it should also be looking to identify kind of key barriers and enablers and make sure that there's actions being taken to address those. Dave mentioned in the Q&A section previously that the kind of clear market signal was the thing that was really missing with the Green Jobs, the Green Homes grant that the UK government did, which was a kind of £1.5 billion programme, which just never got off the ground. And I think what our kind of profound hope is that the Just Transition plans will plug that gap. They will provide that really clear market signal, and they will encourage the appropriate investment in skills and in supply chains that we know we're going to need to underpin all of this work. And the last part of the Just Transition plans is around monitoring and reporting. Really, how do we know we're on track? How can we be transparent and accountable to the people who will have contributed to these plans? How do we make sure that everyone is on the same page? So one of the things we've committed to in the response is that the Minister for Just Transition will give an annual report to Parliament on our progress. And as I mentioned earlier, we would see a kind of cycle of refreshing the plans as well every 5 years or so. So I wanted to sort of finish by talking about the co-design and co-delivered approach, which is the thing that I think it really makes the plans just. It is at the heart of everything that we're trying to do with them. It's also really difficult. It will be really resource intensive to do, but I think it's essential if we are going to succeed. So we'll be aiming to ensure that all of our partners are empowered to engage with us and to engage with each other. We'll be hoping that action is fair and coordinated. And what that really means is that we take those folks who we think are likely to be most negatively impacted by the transition, and we put them right at the heart of everything that we're doing. So there's no point talking about an energy just transition plan without putting oil and gas workers at the heart of your conversations about that plan, because they will be most impacted by the transition. That as well, when you think about future plans, can be much broader than just a kind of an oil and gas worker seeking to retrain. It could be a farmer seeking seed capital to invest in sustainable food production, or just a small business thinking, how do I play my part? I want to make sure that I understand what I'm actually able to do in this wider agenda. And I think this approach is particularly important because we know that government can often go to the usual suspects when we're developing strategies, and we have advisory boards coming out of our ears, and really all of that noise can miss the key elements as a consequence. So we want to make sure that we're really honing in on the people most impacted to make sure it truly is a just transition. Empowering people to shape their future is also essential in maintaining a strong social consensus for change. So how can we expect workers, communities, businesses of all sizes to throw their weight behind plans that they had no role in developing? They must be at the heart of that kind of development process. So this will be something we'll all have to do together. It will be really challenging, but I think really exciting. And as Dave said in his kind of talk, I think we've got a brilliant story to tell about Scotland's journey to net zero. And we are really leading the world when it comes to just transition. This national planning framework is the first ever made. Our level of ambition with just transition is significantly beyond other nations around the world, and will be increasingly looked at as a kind of source of expertise and a source of inspiration, I hope, in terms of our levels of commitment to this agenda. So I'm really keen to keep time for us to talk and to hear your thoughts and reflections. So I'll stop talking, Liz, and pass back to you.
Thanks so much, Katie. That was really interesting. And I think you're right. I mean, there's a lot happening this week in terms of announcements and pronouncements. So not everyone will have had a chance to have a look at the response that you've outlined there, but really good to get a sense of what's in it. We have posted it in the chat box for anyone who wants to check it out during this session. Again, I think, Bo, just another example of the massive shift in focus that is taking place around this agenda. And actually, and it is coming, I mean, I'll be honest, it is coming on the back of a really difficult year for people working in the public sector and all sectors, in response to the pandemic, plus Brexit and the impact of all of that still taking place, and now all of this. So I think there's something for us, we were talking about this morning at our board in EDAS about, what is our role? And there's a question coming up in the poll that I would like everybody to have a real think about, but also to contact us centrally, because we want to make sure that we support people with all that's coming at them right now, because it's a massive amount of policy, information, and directives and changes. So we've clearly got a role to help with that, and we're very keen to help with that. So thanks for that, Katie. I think you're right. It's exciting. It is challenging as well, though. Let's not underestimate that. Okay, moving on now to our final speaker, definitely not least, this afternoon, who's Claire Mack, who's Chief Executive of Scottish Renewables. And Scottish Renewables, for those of you who are not sure or not haven't engaged with Scottish Renewables before, it is the representative voice of Scotland's renewable energy industry. Now, Claire is responsible for leading the organisation's work to grow Scotland's renewable sector and sustain its position at the forefront of a global clean energy industry. Among a range of prestigious positions, Claire is a member of the First Minister's Energy Advisory Board, is co-chair of the Renewable Energy Strategic Leadership Group, and she's also co-chair of the Scottish Government Marine Energy Industry Group. She's also a member of SSEN's Network for Net Zero Stakeholder Group. Before joining Scottish Renewables, Claire was Director of Policy and Place at the Scottish Council for Development and Industry, so her really impressive CV, knowledge and experience makes her an excellent speaker to round off today's conference. So I'm just going to hand over to you now, Claire, to round things off and to give us your perspective on global to local and the opportunities arising from this.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's an absolutely amazing introduction. Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here. I think this may have been my second or third attempt to come and speak at the EDAS conference, what with COVID and various other things getting in the way. So delighted to finally be here, and thank you so much. I've got support for my slides happening in the background too, which is great. So just very quickly, my name is Claire Mack, like Liz said, and I'm Chief Executive of Scottish Renewables. So we're the trade association for the renewable energy industry here in Scotland. I've got about 260 members, and they range all the way from SSE, and people who generate and distribute electricity, all the way down to sort of sole traders, people who do kind of environmental consultancy for the industry to help support projects, and various other roles in between. And I think that's the thing, is that there is a very wide spread of roles in renewables, and that's been a really interesting theme, I guess, across this afternoon as I've been listening to everybody, is that that all jobs will have a kind of green element to them, and they will be greened over time as we move forward towards net zero. Net zero will be an element to pretty much everybody's role, but my roles in my sector are probably much more readily identifiable at the moment as kind of low carbon or net zero type roles already, but not all of them will be obvious to everybody as to what they do. One of the key sort of sets of people who we engage with are lawyers and consultants, and in that legal side of things, there's a lot to do with kind of land management that happens around about renewables as well. So very broad swathe of membership. About 85% of my members generate power. So that it is very much at the heart of what we do, and I'll go through a little bit of that in terms of how the makeup of my organisation looks in a moment. One thing it would be remiss of me not to mention here and now, particularly in the context of global to local, is of course we are very close to COP26, which will be held in Glasgow. And we've been doing a lot of thinking about what this means to the man, woman and child on the street. COP, massive kind of global movement, and hopefully a huge force for good out the back coming, and from November onwards, and we'll gain momentum as we go. But thinking about that, if you think about that in the more localized context here in Scotland, we've been working hard with communities, and we've been working hard with in our rural areas as well, because that's the difference between renewable energy and the energy that preceded it, was that renewable energy is dispersed. It's dispersed around the more rural areas of our country, particularly where perhaps employment opportunities are less obvious and less broad than you will find elsewhere. And that's where we see that every citizen's contribution to net zero has really come into its own, is in these communities where either the communities have supported the development of a site through just generally supporting it through the kind of planning process and being there and around it, either working on some of these sites, either in frontline roles or in roles that have helped support it, such as hospitality and various other places like that too, and living alongside the energy infrastructure. You can't get around the fact that turbines have a visual impact, and there's a broad swathe of opinion about this, around how that is, whether that's positive or negative. The groundswell of opinion is overwhelmingly towards positive nowadays, but that very much is the kind of community impact the community involvement in terms of getting to net zero is working with our developers and helping to, to create these projects and having them on the doorstep and using some of the other bits and pieces that go along with it, because quite often projects come with new infrastructure such as trails and paths and that kind of thing, which actually help to build additional facilities within communities as well, alongside about £1 million a month that goes into Scotland's communities through community benefit schemes from the onshore sector as well. So not only creating jobs and opportunities, but also a kind of healthier and more resilient low carbon economy. That's obviously the aim, that we will obviously get to that as a result of going to net zero. So COP, really, really important, but I'm always keen to stress that it isn't just about, very, very high ambitions at a global level. Actually, each and every citizen has got something to offer COP because of in and through my industry, I guess, is the message that we're giving out there. So moving on to my first slide, which is basically about deployment. So giving you just a bit of an overview of where we are right now. So as you can see on one side of this chart, you've got the kind of deployment capacities out there. You can see the backbone of our industry has very much been onshore wind, which is talking about that kind of community level involvement, community engagement with the energy sector, with the renewable energy sector has been really, really important. Working with communities is something that my sector does on a daily basis, because our social licence to operate is hugely important. And we obviously see very strong levels of public acceptance coming through kind of Bayes opinion polling and things like that for everything that we're doing. But what we're seeing is we're on the cusp of a real drive for further development. Some of that around about just the ambitions that have been put out there. But to just tell you a bit of the story so far is, in the decade to 2020, Scotland almost trebled its renewable energy capacity, and largely that was around onshore wind, from about 4 gigawatts to about 12. And we've actually decarbonised more quickly than any G20 economy since 2008, which is a great, it's been remarked on already. I think Dave mentioned this too, but it's the success story. And much of that progress was driven by the target from the Scottish Government that by 2020, the equivalent of 100% of Scotland's electricity consumption would come from renewables. We're now at about 97.4. We should find out if we've made that 100% in December, but it's still, we've made a phenomenal inroad into that, having covered pretty much all of our electricity demand, and that effectively offsets, that's about the same as our transport sector. So that's where that sort of squares out. So we're displacing that level of carbon emissions already, the whole sort of set of carbon emissions from the transport section already. So we did some research into what are the actual, not just the carbon benefits of this, but what are the sort of economic benefits of this. And our research showed that in 2020, we did some research that showed that every gigawatt of installed renewable power in Scotland creates 1,500 jobs and adds about 133 million of GVA into our economy. But of course, electricity is only a quarter of the energy that we use here in Scotland, and more than half of our energy goes on keeping us warm, and the other quarter goes on that transport sector that we mentioned. And if we want to meet these climate change targets, then we need to make rapid progress in all of these areas, and particularly on renewable heat. So there's a great opportunity in there. We're on the cusp of this development boom driven by those legal commitments to net zero, and much, much firmer UK government backing of renewables, which is largely through offshore wind. They've really engaged with the offshore wind sector for lots of different reasons. But to give you just a quick rundown of how fast and how far we're going to have to go, if you just look at the sort of 4 bullet points down at the bottom there, which is a really good kind of reminder of where the milestones sit about what we've got to do next. And again, will drive a lot of our work kind of going forward, which is great. So the ambition is really, really high, and we're set to really sort of push demand through the market in a way that's really unprecedented. So moving on to the next slide, let's have a look at that demand and generation picture. So what you've got here is some pathways that were looked at by the CCC, so the Committee on Climate Change, who are the advisors to government. How are we going to do this? What's going to happen here? So you can see under every scenario, you've got, enhanced levels of demand, and these sort of 5 or so different scenarios reflect different variables. So some like headwind scenario is based on behavioural change and new technology development. The widespread engagement scenario assumes higher levels of societal and behavioural changes, for example, and widespread innovation, obviously much more technology driven based scenario as you go forward in there. So these are all very, very sort of interesting scenarios to look at. But what you can see obviously in terms of the charts on the right hand side of the screen there is that there's a different mix of technologies that could come in here, and that's very, very important for what we've been talking about as well in terms of place-based strategies and locally based strategies, because the assets are different in different places. The good thing about something like solar, for example, is actually, it's pretty ubiquitous. You can, and it's very underdeveloped in Scotland. You are able to make much more of solar here, but there are different areas where wind speeds are better than others, and where you can get enhanced yield in there and that kind of thing, which would play into different areas, being more likely to develop different types of renewable energy. What's happening now is obviously you're looking at things like electricity for hydrogen production as well, which is, hydrogen's a bit of an unknown quantity at the moment. We know we need it, we're just not sure what scale it's going to come in at. But what's very interesting when you start to look at the different technologies that are talked about in that graph is you can start to see the formation of kind of localized energy systems, and that can be based not just around renewable resources in the area, that can be based around people flows within an area and public sector infrastructure within an area and all that kind of stuff, because even every EV will effectively could be part of a kind of mobile battery network. Every office building roof could be part of your generation network, in that kind of local sense. Every sort of public sector building roof likewise could have that sort of capability. So the way things are coming together in terms of energy systems, localized energy systems and smart energy systems is really, really exciting. And it is starting to see that real blend of public, private sector, citizen and consumer coming together, and prosumer as well is the way that people are looking at this too, where consumers actually become active sellers within markets as well. So it's a really exciting kind of energy future, but a very different one to the one that we've been, we were used to here. And that's a really important part of this next stage of decarbonisation is the role of citizens and consumers. They say behaviour has been factored into each of these different scenarios and how much people are prepared to do. And we really need to move forward with that conversation around what net zero means at that kind of localised and household level, actually, and not just around the sort of funding mechanisms of it. Great that people are thinking about that, but yeah, people are actively seeking to make changes. That certainly is the conversations that we're having with the people when we're out on the road we're doing some road shows around about COP. Very keen. People are very interested in this and they want to be part of it. But interesting for you to see just what's going to happen in terms of the uptick in terms of demand and generation within the UK and where that might come from, because largely, as you can see, it's going to come from that, the light blue part of that chart, which is variable renewables, which is the stuff that I work with, and the growth of a storage network to create a kind of energy system in place there. So moving on to the next slide is that we're looking now at economic impact. That's sort of why I'm here, I guess, is to speak to you guys, because that's very much what your day jobs are and what you're very interested in, of course. So we did some work around about economic impact of the renewable energy industry in Scotland. And the reason why we did that work is that we have a real challenge in terms of data collection here, which is that the national accounts don't break down the renewable sector or sort of the net zero sector, or the low carbon sector in and of itself. So there's a bit of a gap in there. So we've been working with Fraser of Allender Institute, and it's Fraser of Allender Institute who produced this data for us, very much along the same kind of framework that they've used in the past for analysing the oil and gas sector and its economic contribution and its jobs contribution. So what we've got here is an overall jobs figure of 22,660 jobs supported by green energy in Scotland. Not surprisingly, onshore is Scotland's biggest renewables employer. It is the probably the oldest sort of commercial scale deployed renewables technology that we've seen. So around 8,800 full-time equivalent employment in there, followed by offshore wind at 4,700. And then, of course, hydropower. Scotland's geography lends itself very well to hydropower, which means we have a big proportion of the UK's hydropower here. As I've said before, we're already providing the equivalent of 97% of our electricity consumption, but supporting an output of 5.2 billion a year. And we have a good impact on other sectors of the economy. So looking at sectors like construction and manufacturing. And that's what I was sort of referring to when I said sometimes our jobs are not immediately obvious, in that, if you look at an oil and gas oil rig, there will be guys, it will be staffed all the time with guys. You don't see that with an offshore wind farm, but actually the guys who are working on that offshore wind farm are probably down in Dumfries or somewhere else, because they're doing a lot of remote monitoring, which is how a lot of our industry operates, is in that way, because we've got a different profile, we've got different needs as a sector to other sectors, and it is. When you look at the profile of a renewables project, it starts out life on a lawyer's desk. It usually starts out with somebody sort of acquiring land or looking at trying to do way leaves or various other elements of that to try and get the project kicked off. So it sits very much in that services space. Then when it hits the ground, it becomes a construction project. So it gets scooped up usually in that kind of data there. And then the longest stage of a renewables project is in fact the bit after it's been built, which is the operations and maintenance stage, which is 20 to 25 years. Highly predictable jobs profile in that 20 to 25 year space, because we know that we need to operate and maintain these assets because they are crucially important. There. So you've got a really good graph on the other side of that slide there, which is just around about our sort of direct, indirect and induced jobs and where they kind of go in the sector, and not particularly surprising, to see electricity and gas being the obvious space, and then looking at manufacturing, construction, wholesale and retail and things like that along the way. And you can see that accommodation and food services piece, which is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about when we work in rural communities. That's very much what's given in terms of socioeconomic benefits during project builds is into that sort of sector there. So moving on from the economic impact, what's the economic opportunity? Now, this is a really, really key one. And the example that you've got sitting there in front of you is actually from down south, but this is something that we can very much seek to recreate here in Scotland. So we're planning to increase the amount of offshore wind in Scottish waters more than tenfold by 2030, from 1 gigawatt today to 11 gigawatts. Now, when we started out with our plan with offshore wind, we'd hoped to have 10 gigawatts today. That's not happened because our deployment pipeline has stalled. It's encountered difficulties in terms of environmental issues, in terms of legal issues around about that, and various other elements of it have just meant we've not deployed as quickly as we would want to. That's about to change because government have given the offshore wind sector serious backing. Now, ports are actually the linchpin of offshore wind success. They create clusters of businesses which service the growing offshore wind sector around about Scotland. We need ports that have got deep water capability, which is particularly important for new technologies like floating wind, whose structures are sort of towed out to site, and lots of laydown area where large components can be stored and assembled. At the moment, Scotland's only got about sort of 4 to 5 ports which have these attributes, so we do have them, and they're small in number, which means that we can quite readily identify where the opportunities lie. ScotWind, which is the leasing process for the offshore wind industry, for the growth of the offshore wind industry, which is being run by Crown Estate Scotland, has produced a huge amount of interest in ports, and we're starting to see investment flowing in here. So we've seen 90 million go in at NIG. We've got Forth Ports in Leith are looking at £40 million investment, also seeing stuff happening over on the west coast as well. In terms of interest in pulling together investment packages and drawing in like a vortex, obviously all the other kind of companies and people that we want to help support our next sort of set of projects. So with an ambition to increase the amount of offshore wind as much as we want to by 2030, that tenfold increase, we know that port availability is going to be in short supply. Port space is going to be in short supply. So there's a great opportunity in here, and that's why, like I say, you're seeing things like Cromarty, Firth, Leith, Hunterston investing now. Where parts of the world that have developed suitable parts, so you've got Esbjerg in Denmark, you've Bremerhaven in Germany. It's been done as a really strong government and industry collaboration, because these are huge investments, they're highly risky, and the model that we're seeing come to fruition is this one in the Humber, where UK government have invested, and industry have invested 266 million, with huge lumps coming in from the private sector, from Siemens Gamesa and GRI, creating over 1,000 jobs, and into our manufacturing. That's followed an earlier investment of nearly 100 million from UK government and more from the private sector, obviously in Humber and Teesside. What we're trying to do here in Scotland is to have a look at where we should make these investments, and industry is currently working with government through the Strategic Investment Assessment, which has been published, to work out where we would be best to try and develop some assets here in Scotland to attract more money, to attract investment money, but also to attract companies and to attract innovators and everything else that goes alongside that, so that we can have a Humber here in Scotland. And I think that's the prize that's on the table, particularly from a floating wind point of view. Scotland has one of the first sectoral marine plans. That's the plan that tells us where we can develop offshore wind sites. One of the first sectoral marine plans has commercial scale floating offshore wind opportunities. Now, floating offshore wind is really important because at the moment it's still a relatively expensive technology, which means from various different points of view, the offshore wind sector is global, it's highly competitive. All of our supply chain has to compete on quality, cost, and reliability. And that's been where we've seen challenge in terms of the fixed offshore market, which is that companies that invested years ago in things like serial manufacture, invested in automation in terms of technology, invested in skills back then, are the ones who've picked up the prizes to date. And that's because we didn't have an industrial strategy around the fixed offshore wind market. That can change with floating. We can do this. We're now still looking at relatively high priced technology that would allow us to cut our teeth, allow us to work out what we're really good at, allow us to really play to those strengths and invest in those strengths, and be able to really take the economic prizes that are available, the socioeconomic prizes that are available for us here as a nation, because we've got those commercial scale floating sites which provide so much more power. They really are, in terms of bang for buck, they're going to be huge from that point of view, and huge opportunity there as well to develop our prowess in that sort of supply chain and manufacturing base. So moving on from there, my last slide is essentially just around enablers. So one of the key messages I want to be really clear about here is you don't get employment without deployment, right? That's the key thing, is that you need to be able to deploy renewables in order to take jobs from them. And one of the key enablers, and it's one of the reasons, it's one of the places where we really, really interact very fully with the public sector is in the planning space. And this is only sort of one of the key enablers, but the pipeline is all important, and keeping that pipeline flowing and accelerating that pipeline is going to be the key enabler for us into this next decade. That is what is going to help us create jobs and create them sooner, and create them faster than we would have done otherwise. And planning is central to this. And another example, like I say, of where public and private sector working together can be really, really beneficial, because we as a trade association have had a look at the planning system in Scotland. We recognise its key enabling role, and have also recognised that it's under-resourced for the job that is coming down the path to. And that is a really important thing for us as a sector, but it's really important for us to be able to say back to the public sector too, is that it needs that kind of resourcing. So that's the conversation with Scottish Government, obviously, that we're having, which is local authority planners need to be supported in this process. And that's not just about numbers of people, it is also about skills. There's something else in there too around about ensuring that the skills for net zero are something that's front of mind and that is being delivered. So we had to look at this in a numbers and from a numbers perspective first and foremost, which is we've seen the number of planners in Scottish councils have fallen by 20% in the last 10 years, but we are expecting more to come out of that system in terms of number of applications that they're going to have to grant to help us stay on track for net zero. And we also saw, obviously, because of that, the number of staff having fallen by that 20%, in the numbers terms, that goes from 1,500 down to about 1,200. And in the past 10 years, we've grown our renewable electricity capacity, and we've got a number of planning applications there. And so we can start to see exactly where this logjam is going to come in. So we're going to have to install more than we have already in terms of meeting our net zero targets, but with a system that is actually depleted and has been decreasing over time. So it's a really, really critical conversation around about those enablers. There are other areas where there are enablers that we are heavily reliant on our friends in the public sector too, around about just working out rights and responsibilities of different users of the sea through colleagues at Marine Scotland, and how we interact with different industries like fishing and oil and gas, for example. But yeah, all those enablers, some of them sit on the kind of environmental side, and some of that just needs research and data. But there are other levers that we can pull in terms of enablers that would set us on a path to be able to create that pipeline of deployment, which then will obviously deliver the jobs that we're looking for at the other end of this, and jobs in areas that are not necessarily ones that we find it easy to create high value, high skill employment in otherwise. So I think there's a really strong opportunity in there. I think I'll finish on that note, because I'm not sure how much time we've got left for Q&A, but I will leave it there and pass you back to Liz as chair.
Unmute myself there. Thanks so much, Claire. Yeah, we have run over slightly, but Claire, there was so much information, so much valuable information and detail that I think people need to hear, that I think it's been really worthwhile, you know, actually taking the time to hear what you have to say. So thank you very much. That was really interesting, really in depth, and also I think giving our audience just an alternative perspective on things, because you know, that this kind of depth of detail that you're providing there around renewables is not something we've really covered to any great extent up to now, but my goodness, the implications are quite significant for our economic development sector. Now, I just want to check if we have any questions in the chat box. I can see that Alan, again, has posted just saying, good to highlight the issue of resourcing for planning. It's such a key role to play in enabling net zero projects, and the clock's ticking, absolutely. And you know, again, probably something that, you know, wouldn't necessarily come to the forefront when you start to think about the implications for green jobs, but clearly planning is right up there. Can I ask, do we have any questions? And I can't see everybody, so if you could raise your hand, and I will be guided by my colleagues working diligently in the background as to whether I have to alert anyone. Can I ask for any volunteers on this? I know it's a lot of information to take in, but it would be good to have some, or maybe everyone's just been shocked into silence by the scale of what we're facing here, because, you know, that was a lot of detail in both presentations.
Yeah, and I think it is, though, I think there's a good kind of nexus in here. And one of the things I didn't really tackle, which Katie kind of did, is that skills transfer. You know, it's something that, you know, I've talked a lot about the technology side of things and the deployment side of things. You know, I'm a B2B business, but skills are hugely important in that space as well. And we've been working very closely with the oil and gas sector to try and work out where the crossovers are between these two skill sets. It's been a very interesting few years from that point of view, because we did some work with oil and gas workers. We did some polling of oil and gas workers who were all actually very positive about perhaps moving into renewables, and see that as a good opportunity to be dual skilled for a while, and then perhaps make a sort of full transition. And they're one of the key messages that came out of that was an appetite to see skills transfer programs. So to have seen so much of that come through the programme for government and various other platforms in the last sort of year or so is great, because there's definitely going to be a demand for that, and being able to move that. I think what we've got as well as a supply chain that is transitioning, and that's what we as an industry really need to work on, is that skills passporting piece, to make this as easy for people as possible. But let's not forget that the biggest kind of opportunity in terms of skills transfer here is actually in that heat space. Again, very nascent market, but we already have, you know, a huge body of people working in gas engineering, you know, and operations and maintenance, if you want to call it that. So that's when the gas man comes every year to look at your boiler. And that is still going to happen, you know, even when you move to sort of heat pumps or any other way of heating your home, that's still going to need to happen. So again, having dual fuel operators in that space is really important. And I know Scottish Government are doing a lot of work on you know, potential for heat, because what we need first and foremost is that plan for heat. You know, what is going to be the impetus to move renewable heat forward. And I think EY have done a report that was one of the few reports that I'm aware of that said, in terms of we're going to need 10,000 heat pump installers by 2025. We've got about 1,200 today. I think that's probably a UK-wide figure. But that just gives you an idea of the scale. You know, that's over a 4-year period. You're going to grow that number of jobs. And I think as long as we're up to that challenge, and I think a lot of the work that we're doing, and we've heard about it this afternoon, is really sort of, you know, rising to meet that particular challenge. And heat is a huge opportunity for us, not just from, you know, from a manufacturing point of view, as well as the other elements of it too.
Trying to unmute myself again. I think what's really become apparent really strongly from this afternoon and from the detail of this afternoon's presentations is really the kind of multifaceted nature. I mean, and today is just about skills development, business opportunities. You know, we've got a further session where we're going to be looking at place as part of this whole dimension. You know, so but it's the complexity, the multifaceted nature of this, all the policy initiatives and the directives and the detail of that. Never mind all the other implications around, you know, what people have to plan for. It's, I suppose, one of the things that I'm reflecting, and I think we actually all need to probably go away now and reflect on what's been said here and replay the presentations from today, because I think it'll take a little bit of time to percolate down. But one of the things that is kind of, I think is possibly coming out is just the opportunity to kind of level off perhaps differences that have previously existed around rural economies and urban economies. And actually the opportunities here have a great potential to really bring so much to all Scotland in its entirety, you know, from the islands in the furthest north, right the way across to the kind of borders and everything in between. And that's potentially really exciting, but it's massive, this whole agenda. And I think what's come across today is just we've all, you know, I think we've all been aware of it, but perhaps it's, for me anyway, it's come across very much in that regard. Claire, I apologize, I hope Claire's still there. Claire had her hand up. Claire McLeod had her hand up there. If you want to come in, Claire, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question really, and maybe more towards Katie, but it was really about, and I'm always looking at what the obstacles and hurdles are. So we're trying to create new companies, we're under company formation, I'm Scottish Enterprise, and looking at what those obstacles and hurdles might be, and there are quite a few at the moment. We're finding a much lower uptake on programs and things so we're trying to get to grips with that, why that might be. And so the big question for us often is in trying to create companies is when we look at what's happening. This is maybe in the wind sector. So I'm working on net zero at the moment, and with companies feeding into that supply chain and I mentioned earlier, we have just lost another company up in Machrihanish, so with a loss of 94 jobs, and that's a real big blow to us. And so whilst we're trying to get people into to change their outlook, we've always got this awful thing in the background. People go, oh well, you know, if we can't get the work, what is the point? So there is no point in pursuing this. So it's to look at, my question probably is, what, if anything, can we do in a free market to ensure that we can get these companies to stay in Scotland and to be able to win contracts? What's stopping them winning contracts? And why are we not? We're leading on so many other fronts, and yet this last hurdle we seem to fall, and that's a real big issue. And I wonder how that's being addressed. Not just in wind farms and offshore wind, but right across the net zero sectors.
Okay, who wants to respond to that?
I'll take the first bit first in terms of offshore wind farms. So I think one of the things we need to be really clear about is you know, basically what other countries have done to prepare themselves, and I sort of alluded a little bit to that in my presentation, is that where we've struggled is in that heavy manufacturing space, where we've got to compete on quality, cost and reliability, and that's just a fact of the market, unfortunately. Everyone's got a role to play in the success of those supply companies, the companies themselves, government and developers, and sometimes it's the case that investments that should have been made and made in more favourable economic times just were not made. And that's what I mean is investments in skills, investments in technologies and policies that would facilitate supply chain growth, because we are seeing tower and blade manufacturing come back to the northeast of England. So it can be done. It has been done, but it does need that partnership of private and public sector finance. One of the things in Scotland is that we've seen some pretty high profile failures in terms of business, and that's not the whole sector. I mean, companies are investing and they are winning work. One offshore wind farm can create hundreds of millions of pounds worth of benefit for Scottish companies, and we've got some great examples. You've got big money going into places like Global Energy Group up in Nigg, pasting like £90 million in there in the last 9 years.
And are they manufacturing, or are they just, or are they building? They're actually manufacturing.
Yeah, they've got plans to build £100 million wind fabrication facility up at Nigg, producing towers and creating jobs, and another more in the supply chain. In terms of export, you've got Leask Marine in Orkney investing 1.5 million in submersible drilling rigs, already working on Scottish offshore wind farms, and that's an export story too, because they're winning work across the whole of Europe. They've got contracts in Denmark with the Walney extension down south, and across other areas across the whole of Europe. And obviously we've got future potential as well. So you've got some really great innovation stories, and it is about playing to those strengths. So that, to answer your question, is exactly where I would go, is using a very strategic approach to investment here. So we've seen First Subsea create a mooring connector that was developed to address shortfall in mooring technology in that floating offshore wind market, and now they've been working with the construction company Cobra on the Kincardine offshore wind farm. We've got Partrack in Glasgow, been working on the NNG wind farm since 2009. Their surveys have been essential to NNG, so that's environmental monitoring to try and measure the height and force of waves, useful across the globe, The specialist team working on specialist products like specialist buoys within the sea, and to try and make sure that they've grown from a 3 to a 20 strong team by securing work on many, many other projects in the sector. So I think we need to be very clear that whilst we have had some very high profile failures, actually what sits behind that is some very, very strong success stories, which we need to make sure the rest of the world hears, because there is a global opportunity here. This is something that we've seen in Scotland for the last 40 to 50 years with the oil and gas sector, is an incredibly mobile sector. I'm sitting right here in Larbar. I live on the edge of Grangemouth, and I've seen a huge shift, because the refinery has changed what it has done. And there aren't any people now who worked at Grangemouth, I wouldn't have said, who haven't spent a spell somewhere else in the globe. And that's just something that will be, is a feature of the energy industry. And it's something that I very much hope we can all get behind, which is creating these great companies here in Scotland and opening up that export market. There's another reason why COP is amazing. I think Dave said this earlier, eyes of the world are upon us. Fantastic platform for us to sing the praises of everything that we've done in terms of renewables, because we've gone earlier than everybody else in that journey, and we can help take them on that journey and hopefully give them the people and expertise along the way to make a success of it.
Okay, I'm mindful of time here, and I think we're starting to lose a few of the audience, possibly because of the time nature of obviously we said we would end by 15:15, so I don't want to cut things off, but at the same time I do want to just allow for at least one more question. David McIntosh, and David has raised a question in the chat box about capacity issues. David, do you want to come in just quickly with this?
Yeah, look, Claire and Katie will both get it, so happy for them to answer.
Yeah, so having a quick look at that. So capacity issues around enabling progress in central and local government, I think that's absolutely right. I think that is somewhere, we are going to be very heavily reliant on the public sector for things. I think one of the areas I would point to give you a very quick answer is how good we've been at this so far in other sectors. So I came in from the telecom sector, and in there we were worried about a huge shortfall of software engineers. So we created fast track programs for people to get through that, and we can do that, and we've been really successful at that. And I think that's the kind of approach that we need to take to this, which is, and let's not discriminate between public and private sector training. I think one of the things we've looked at in terms of offshore wind is that actually we need everybody who's working on the other side of the fence, if you want to call it that, to know what our people know, understand the project pipeline, understand where the key points are. To that end, we've been doing a little bit of work on some e-modules. Largely this has been features of work down south, but e-modules to work with the arm's length agencies, so the likes of, you know, Marine Scotland, it would be up here, and others, Nature Scotland, other places as well. We were really heavily reliant on them to help us facilitate that consenting process, but being able to just allow them to understand we live in a corporate world of very project management driven stuff, and it doesn't necessarily always work to the same timelines. And perhaps we're dealing with people who've never been in the same place as we have. We're answering up to boards about project milestones and why some of these things are so critically important. So just trying to lift the lid on that, I think, is really helpful, just to get a better understanding going between the two, but making sure that you've got people in those arm's length agencies who know as much about your projects as much as they can, and as much as they can as the people who are actually working on them, I think is crucially important. But also that fast tracking training programs, I think also we've been really good at them in the past.
Katie, do you have anything you want to add? I have a question for you, actually, just very briefly to end this. But do you have anything you want to add to what's just been said?
Well, I think that's really comprehensive from Claire, but yeah, it is a gigantic problem. I don't think there are a series of really obvious solutions beyond, can we find a way to get more money to frontline services and then do some of that skills transferability that Claire has set out. And also going back to something you said right at the beginning, Liz, I think we've got a wider problem in that we've got a public sector that's exhausted, that has worked incredibly hard during COVID, and we've maybe got some bandwidth and some capacity problems that we need to navigate to in short order. So yeah, I have no answer, but very cognizant of the problem.
Yeah, I suppose just to finally, just to round that off, I was really conscious in your presentation, Katie, and I really agree. I and EDAS, we would all agree with this, of the importance, you know, of co-design, co-production, bringing the people who are affected by decision making in as part of the decision making process. I am very conscious from experience in previous job roles and work that that is something that takes a particular type of facilitation. It takes particular skills. It also takes time, you know, and we're talking about moving this agenda forward at pace. And I just wonder, you know, is there any thought going into, I mean, I realize you've just published the document, so I don't know to what extent this has been thought through yet, but I suppose I'm flagging it up because I think it is important to think it through, that, you know, certainly as part of previous big transformational projects around care, for example, social care, it's been really important to think about how do you address culture change, how do you address leadership, how do you really work with the people who are going to drive this agenda to make sure that they're able to do so, and that all of those elements you're describing, which are really important, are enabled, because they don't come naturally to people perhaps in previous job roles. And our public sector, which make up the bulk of our membership, I think most of our members would, and I count myself in this because having worked in local authorities previously, you know, there's a lot of risk aversion, and people aren't empowered to take decisions and to lead on things. So there's something in the mix here about culture change and adapting people's skill sets, both in terms of their knowledge base, but also in terms of the kind of softer skills side of things as well, for collaboration and partnership. And so I don't know how far you've got with that, but anything that we can do in EDAS to help you with that, we would most definitely want to explore, I think, going forward. And likewise, Claire, on when you were mentioning the e-modules, I think we've already started a conversation potentially about looking at how we could perhaps collaborate on sharing some of the learning through that as well through EDAS. So I think we're very much viewing our conference sessions and the speakers that we have as being the start of an ongoing relationship, because this agenda is not going anywhere. In fact, if anything, it's growing. So I think I'm going to round things up. I am very conscious of time, and I've failed completely to keep us within the boundaries of our agenda time, but I think it's been very worthwhile nonetheless, because the contributions have been so fantastic. If you would just indulge me, those of you who are remaining in the room, we do have one more poll. I'm quite keen to get in just before we finish. So Ewan, can I hand over to you quickly to take us through that?
Absolutely. Hopefully you can all hear me. Just make sure that we're on full screen there. So we've just got quick 2 questions that we'd like your feedback on. if possible. Thank you very much for your participation. Just adjust my screen. So here is the QR code and the link again, which you may already have open from previously, and the code is also in the chat. So the first question is, as you can read here on the screen, from the first conference session, EDAS is already taking forward a climate community of practice. What other role do you think EDAS should play? And you can see the 4 options there, and it would just be really useful to have your feedback on that for EDAS to be able to further shape its role on this agenda going forward. So I'll just give you a little 15-20 seconds to have a look at that. It's really helpful to see those responses coming in, and executive team and EDAS board will take this very much into account. Really interesting. No one for EDAS should simply focus on other topics, and that's very useful to have in and take into account. Okay, I think I'll move on to the next question. I think everyone that wanted to has responded to that. Is that fine for you, Liz, if I move on?
Yep, that's good, that's good, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Oh, got another answer in there, that's great. Okay, going to move on to the next question and final question. So, as there will be a community of practice on this agenda, as I understand it, we would simply like to know, what do you feel our community of practice should be called? And you can see here, there's a list of options: climate community of practice, just transition, and net zero community of practice. So that simply for our interest, it would be really interesting to see if you have any preference on these names, which would be most appropriate, most catchy. That's great to see you having a think there. Okay, seems net zero currently has strong preference among those responding, with quite a few for climate community of practice as well. That's really good for us to see. I think on that there may be 1 or 2 more to come in, but I'll just pass back to you, Liz, for final comments.
Thanks, Ewan. And that last one was just a quick additional question we added in, because we did actually launch our climate community of practice at the end of June, but we were thinking the heading isn't quite what we're looking to take forward, simply because the agenda is moving so fast on this. So we will make that adjustment. Okay, can I just finish off by thanking all of our speakers today, Dave, Marissa, Claire, and Katie, really fantastic contributions, and really appreciate you giving up your time to be here this afternoon. Want to thank Ewan for helping with the polling, that's been excellent. Elaine and Alison for making the session happen. For our sponsors, who are ICE, the Institute of Civil Engineers Scotland, and SDS Skills Development Scotland, who again, we very much appreciate supporting these events. But most of all, for you to attend, for those of you who are attending and contributing to such a really interesting session. As always, we would love your feedback. So please don't think, the polls or anything like that are the final chance you have to speak to us. Do get in touch with us if there's anything you feel is missing or you want us to cover in future events. We will have another conference event, the day 3 of our conference series, taking place, we believe, in November this year. So look out for all the details of that as we develop it. But in the meantime, just take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay well, and let's hope that we continue to open up again. And one day we may be able to meet in person in a room together. Okay.